Hi, this is Paul, and I'm continuing my Jordan Peterson project. Someone asked me when I posted some things from another class that I did, well, these don't really pertain to Jordan Peterson. Well, I'm not going to promise that everything I do on my channel pertains to Jordan Peterson. I'm working on Peterson now because he interests me, and I think he's helping me work through a lot of things. And these videos that I do about Jordan Peterson are basically my process of working through his stuff. I went back and looked over some blogs and some other things, and I think I started in on Peterson last June, so I haven't been working on him a year now. And when I find someone or something that interests me like this, I usually stay with it for a while, and until I think I pretty much exhaust it or find what I'm looking for. And so today I want to talk about how Jordan Peterson undermines the subtraction story and leaves room for God. Obviously, I'm a pastor, and so I'm always thinking about this stuff, and the big question that I hear people asking is, why is everyone paying so much attention to Jordan Peterson? Why are so many people, after watching all of Jordan Peterson's videos, more interested in God and or Christianity and or the Bible than they were before? And this has been a big question of mine. I want to know why. I want to understand how this is working in the culture and how this is working in our minds. And so I'll get into, as I have in a number of my past videos, I'll get into questions of the mind, questions of being, questions of reality. Now, when I talk about the subtraction story, this is Weber. There's a Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor. That's his face over on the other book. And this philosopher wrote a very large book called A Secular Age. And he tried in this book to walk through the narrative of what happened between 1500 and 2000 to our culture in the West. Why in 1500 everyone believed in God. God was, in Taylor's words, axiomatic. And why in 2000 belief in God is problematic. And he says most of the time this transition is told via a subtraction story. And in this video I'll tell the subtraction story, and then I'll explain how I think Jordan Peterson's work is undermining the subtraction story. And because he's undermining the subtraction story, this is leaving room for God. Now, you can read Charles Taylor's huge book, A Secular Age. James K. Smith, who's a Canadian philosopher who teaches at Calvin College, which is the college of my denomination, he has been making a little cottage industry of making making Charles Taylor accessible. And so he's got a small book, How to Not Be Secular, and James K. Smith actually has a number of other books where he talks about contemporary liturgies. And it would be a fun conversation to hear James K. Smith talk to Jordan Peterson. I mean, we all, in the words of my teenage daughters, we're always shipping people, which means we want to put people together. And so I'd love to see Jordan Peterson have a conversation with James K. Smith. I think that could be a really cool conversation. But the subtraction story basically goes like this. In the beginning, people believed in the supernatural because maybe they didn't know any better, because they didn't have science, or they were afraid of the big bad world. This is kind of a psychoanalytic reason. This would be a reason like, Freud might say, well, it's our fears, or it's certain things going on deep inside our minds that made us believe, like, we were afraid of the big bad world, so we created stories to make us feel better. And so basically, if you look at, the landscape, the ancient peoples believed that they were creatures in the water, or gods in the water, or spirits in the water, and spirits in the forest, and spirits in the trees, and spirits in the mountains, and spirits in the sky. And you can see this represented here with the story of Nut and Geb. This is obviously an Egyptian picture of the cosmos, and you'll see the ground below, and you'll see the firmament above, and you see the sun and the moon, and all of this is populated by spirits and by beings, and we might imagine that in the ancient world, then people just projected all of these gods onto the world. And you see this, then they use mythology to explain the world, but these are just superstitions and stories. And so you have Marduk fighting Tiamat, and then you have this is pretty much worldwide. You have this in Mesoamerica, where they had human sacrifice and they would take out the hearts. And then once we have this idea of that the gods were up there, and we, in a sense, enchanted or personified or mythologized the universe, and then through magic and religion, we attempt to interact that. And this is someone's idea of how the Nut and Geb representation connects with the Great Pyramid, and of course you can see, and Freud would love this one. So this is what religion is, but then what along comes science, and we know science is better, because here's a doctor during the Black Death, and he's wearing that beak which is full of herbs and things, and that's supposed to protect him, but what he really needed was an exterminator to get rid of the rats that would get rid of the fleas that would stop the plague, and basically, so there's a subtraction theory that once we disenchant the world, we now take control of the world, because we now, through science, can take hold of what's really happening, what's really beneath all of this, which is materiality and chemistry and biology and physics. And Yuval Harari, in his book Homo Deus, puts this very succinctly, that we had three great enemies. We had plague and war and famine, and now via our ability to via science to control the material world, for the first time in history, more people die today from eating too much than from eating too little. More people die today from old age than from infectious disease, and more people commit suicide than are killed by soldiers, terrorists, and criminals combined. In the early 21st century, the average human being is far more likely to die from binging at McDonald's than from drought, Ebola, or an Al-Qaeda attack. And so therefore science, see, now this communicates to us, and we're going to get into a little bit what I call my Jungian great cloud of witnesses. This communicates to the watchers that are inside our head, yeah, gods are obsolete and dumb, and we're done with them, and now we have science, and so now we know the world. Now Peterson steps into this, and he says, and I think, again, one of his best interviews is this 2015 transliminal interview. And he says, yeah, but being isn't as simple as that. There's certainly the material or the physical layer. That's obviously one of the key and integral layers of reality, but there's also then in that video he called it the dominance hierarchy, and since then he's revisited it, and we'll call it the competence hierarchy or the authority hierarchy. And that's something you cannot be a human being and not be dealing with that. And then there's also the subjective or the phenomenological layer. And so Peterson says, there are three layers to this. And what he says that, Harris and Dawkins are in a sense Newtonian. And they're Newtonian because they imagine that we have direct access to objects. And Peterson is in fact going to undermine this, because he says, the truth is, and he goes through this in his maps of meaning and his personalities, he says, we don't see objects, we see tools. And I remember when I first heard this from Peterson, I thought, he's right. This is exactly right, because when, for example, for those of you who, you should clean up your room, but my office is a mess. I don't know if that makes me unsorted, but my office is a mess. But when I walk in my office, even though it's very chaotic, full of all kinds of random things, if something is different, I see it immediately. Why? Because we see tools. And so Peterson has the illustration of the people passing around the basketball and the guy in the ape suit who comes in the middle, and we don't see this guy. Well, why don't we see this guy? Because we see tools. And this also deeply impacts how we treat other human beings. And often, and if you go back over my sermon archive, you'll see that I often make the point that part of one of the real big decisions we have in this world are we going to love people, or are we going to use people? And here's a crazy thing about human being. We all want to be loved, and we all hate to be used. But it's so completely natural to us that we see tools. We don't see objects, or at least first. And then Peterson says that hierarchies, dominance, authority, not dominance, authority, competency, various hierarchies are always in play. And this accounts in a sense for the evolution of religions, and it in fact accounts for the continuation of religions. And so I wanted to play a little bit from his Maps of Meaning course here. And I remember the first time I listened to this, I was at home and I was doing the dishes, where I listen to a lot of things. I'm driving or doing the dishes, and I just had to stop, because the truth of what he was saying just grabbed onto me, and I began to see, oh my goodness, he's right about this. So let's play a little bit this about cars. Come on, computer, you can do it.
They have this concept called alienation, and the idea was that human beings become alienated from their creative products. So, and here's why it happens. So, imagine Henry Ford makes the assembly line, right? So Ford has no idea what's going to happen when he makes the assembly line.
One of the things I noticed when I was at the live Peterson event, the simulation event in San Francisco, that he does have this practice of speaking to individuals one at a time, and he's talked about this before. In fact, that this for him is I won't go into it too deeply, but it gives you a little bit of insight into his psyche and who he is, that he does practice this as someone who does public speaking regularly. It's very interesting.
He's just trying to figure out a fast way to make cars, or he thinks that what he's making is cars. So he thinks he's making an assembly line for cars, and he thinks he's making cars. And you think, well, what's wrong with that? Well, first of all, the assembly line absolutely transformed the entire planet, right? Because it brought in the era of mass, cheap manufacturing. It's like it was way more than he thought it was. And then, did he make a car? Well, a car is something that hypothetically takes you relatively effectively from point A to point B. It was really a replacement for the horse and buggy. I mean, the first cars looked like that. They were horseless carriages. Well, did he make a car? Well, it's hard to tell what Henry Ford made. He made a very effective way for transforming the atmosphere, right? And the fact that it also happened to take you from point A to point B might be just completely irrelevant compared to the fact that it was the internal combustion engine and its rapid distribution completely changed the constituent, the fundamental chemical structure of the atmosphere itself. It completely transformed cities. It blew out the rural community. Everyone moved to the cities, right? It made all the cities built around the automobile. But then it had this tremendous political and economic significance too. So, I mean, part of the reason that, because you think, well, a car is a way to get from point A to point B. But no, it's not a machine. It's also the embodiment of an idea. And it's a very strange idea. A collectivist society would have never invented the car, because the car is predicated on the idea that you could own a conveyance that would get only you from somewhere to somewhere else without ever asking anybody for any permission. And so the funny thing is when you build something like that, those presuppositions are built into it. And then when you export that, say to Soviet Russia, they can't just take the car and leave the political implications behind. The car, the mere fact that you step into one and drive it, is an indication that you're accepting the political, ideological presuppositions that are part of the fact that that thing even exists.
And if you listen to this, you can understand why he made such a big deal about the pronouns. Because if, in a sense, the West, the car into the Soviet Union was the camel's nose for the destruction of the Soviet Union, well, the use of these, in his words, made-up pronouns is the camel's nose into the destruction of our society.
So, well, that's alienation. It's like, even something you make, you think, well, you have control over what you make because you've made it, you understand it. It's like, no, you don't. You understand a tiny fraction of it. You launch it out in the world, man, and the snakes inside of it, the hydras inside of it, multiply their heads massively, constantly, and you can't really keep track of it.
And you see, with this, in a sense, he completely undermines the subtraction story, in that and why he calls Harris and Darwin Newtonians is because they imagine the world is simple. They imagine that what we're doing is making a car in order to get rid of the problem of horse waste in the cities, which was part of why they made the car. And what Peterson says is, there's way, 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 way more going on. We just don't see it. And the reason he says this is Newtonian is because for Newton, well, here's the things in front of us, and we measure the speed of this ball, we measure how far the ball falls, and we just have access, we have direct access to reality through these sciences. And Peterson is saying, we don't have anything of the kind. We're doing stuff, but then the stuff we're doing, we don't begin to understand the consequences or where all this stuff is taking us.
And so even in your relationship with created entities, you still see the reemergence of this underlying fundamental substructure, right? Even inside, it's the Garden of Eden. There's always a snake inside the thing that's walled in. Always, always, always. Even God himself cannot get rid of the snakes in the garden. And partly what that means is that, you know, the garden is a conceptual system. It's the conceptual system within which people exist. That's Eden is a walled garden. Paradise means walled garden. And it's walled because a walled garden is where people live, because the wall is culture and the garden is nature, and we always live in a structure that's an amalgam of nature and culture. So we set it up so it's paradisal as long as we're unconscious, but we can't manage it because there's always something chaotic that's coming in that we will interact with.
Now, if we were to, Jordan Peterson is promising to get through the Bible, and if he goes at the pace that he's been going, he's not going to live that long. Nobody does. But so you begin in the garden, and the story of the Bible actually ends in the New Jerusalem, and in the New Jerusalem there isn't any sea. Well, and people say, well, why isn't there any sea in the New Jerusalem? I like the sea. The sea is wonderful. The sea is beautiful. We need the sea to survive. No, you don't get you're missing the point. That somehow in the story of the Bible, what this work of God results in the Bible is that chaos is finally, I don't even know the right word to use, but there's no more tears, there's no more crying, there's no more war, there's no more night, there's no more darkness. The city has walls, but the gates are open because there's nothing to fear from the outside. And so, you know, what Peterson is saying is that these Newtonians are simplistic, and they don't actually fully account for what's really going on. And so what he says is that, he actually says this in the transliminal video, that something isn't true if it's destroying us. Now he'll backtrack on that a little bit in Maps of Meaning 2017, which I will play a little bit later. But and so he's saying that, you know, the reductionist materialists can't be right. And well, actually, and this is interesting, that in Harari's quote, which I read before, you look at this, and the more people commit suicide than are killed by soldiers, terrorists, and criminals, which leads into the question of, okay, in our elimination of war, we did what to ourselves so that if we're no longer killing each other on the battlefield, and I'm not advocating that, we kill ourselves? Well, what's the connection there? And the problem with the materialist, he says, we've gotten rid of war. And what Peterson is saying is that, well, wait a minute, we are much bigger than that, and you cannot a couple of years ago, I've used this slide in my previous stories before. I went to an alligator farm in Florida, and there was a big alligator named Goliath. And so I'd go to this alligator farm. All these alligators just sitting around in these concrete ponds, and they feed them. They just throw them frozen. They just throw them chicken, and they gobble up the chicken. And I said, to the guy, well, don't these alligators get bored? He's like, nah, they got tiny little brains. You put them in a pool of warm water, they just breed, and you throw them chicken, and they're happy and dumb. Human beings are not like that. And so therefore the materialist conception of what we are is insufficient. And that's exactly what Peterson is doing. And one of the best illustrations of this, if you've never read Brave New World, you must read Brave New World, because it is a prophecy, and it shows us how we are. And well, if you've never read Brave New World, you simply must read it. One of the commenters, I won't divulge his name because I didn't get his permission to do so. This actually wasn't a comment. This was a message to me, and I was wrestling at that point with the Newtonian Darwinian thing, and he explained it to me. And for me, people are like, well, why are you doing these videos on Jordan Peterson? And I'm doing these videos on Jordan Peterson to learn. And actually, the comments I get from you all who are watching the videos are a big part of my education. And a little bit later, I'll have a book I started reading because someone put that book in the comments section. But this very perceptive watcher of my videos said this. When he brings up Newtonians versus Darwinians, it is in regard to what is the true form of the natural world. I think of it like two poles. Newtonians say that matter is ultimate. Darwinians say that the observer is ultimate. And if you go back in my videos and you read that section that I've read in about 3 videos from the Metaphysical Club, where Finchness is the variable there. What a tremendous insight that happens because of Darwin's revolution. So something is more true for a Darwinian in the pragmatic sense that helps the observer survive. Whereas the Newtonian says the world is the source of truth. Whether or not the observer is there, it doesn't matter. I think of Newtonian coming from the top, absolute matter. Darwinian being pragmatism coming from the very bottom. The conscious observer. Peterson's rational perspective of religion fits in with the Darwinian because whether or not it is ultimately mechanically true doesn't matter. You hear Peterson say this all the time. If it's true enough for the conscious observer and it works. And that's his case, and that's his case that it is true in the ultimate Darwinian sense. It works across lives and across all times. Whether no one is there to observe it from a physics Newtonian standpoint is irrelevant to him. The distinction only matters for the naturalist, but it's his reason it's true from the naturalist perspective if you can view it as Darwinian truth. And so in a sense, Peterson says, here you have the materialists, and they're looking at object. And so they're inventing the car, and the car gets us from point A to point B. This is Newtonian, and it almost imagines that human beings are like gators in a gator farm. Give us some warm water, give us some chicken, give us the lady gators, and off we go. This is all we need. And Peterson comes along and says, no way, you can't talk that way. That simply doesn't true. That story governs stuff. And in fact, in our life, story governs stuff. We see tools, we don't see objects. And so, and we have hierarchies. There's my little ladder with the people climbing on it. And so, this is being. And so this, in a sense, the yellow box is the Darwinian view where, we have to limit this limits what we have. And this is why Peterson is an agnostic with respect to ontology and metaphysics. Now, in the conversation he had with Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin, where he says, metaphysics meets, he had that same conversation with Coffin, the Roman Catholic guy, in that video. He's talking about metaphysics meeting, and it's like, okay, well, now we're getting into the Logos and the Gospel of John and the Word becoming flesh. But Peterson is finally an agnostic in my read of him, because he can't say, every time you ask him about the resurrection, which is in very much where metaphysics and materiality meet, he can't answer that. Well, why can't he answer that? He can't answer that because of his box of epistemological Darwinianism. That is keeping him in. But now a materialist may jump in and say, aha, but here's the thing. Your story depends on brains. And well, Jordan Peterson, you might be smart and you might see that story, our story world and our brain worlds co-evolve at the same time, but you get rid of the brain and you get rid of the story. And so in the final analysis, which is in a sense what William Lane Craig's point was, what C.S. Lewis's point is, and especially in his, you can find it on C.S. Lewis Doodle's Life in an Atomic Age. Science isn't telling us, doesn't give us any hope beyond the cold death of the universe. That no brain, no story, which is where supernaturalists come in. And now again, nature and supernature, these are far later categories than we have in the ancient world, but they're in many ways implicit in many of the stories, and ancient peoples understood the difference between natural and supernatural, and whether or not you believe in the virgin birth, even the story of the virgin birth bears witness to, and C.S. Lewis makes this point again and again, the story of the virgin birth bears witness to the fact that all the ancients understood that babies follow sex. And so if you have a story of a woman being pregnant without sex, everybody understands what a miracle is. It isn't the case that in the ancient world people just saw miracles all over the place. No, they understood what miracles were, which is why they paid attention to them and why they wrote about them and why their stories were the way they were. And so now I'm going to continue to getting into C.S. Lewis's book on miracles, but I want to play some of what is Maps of Meaning 12, the finale, where he talks about the divine individual, and I've made comments before. I would probably edit that language a little bit, but let's take a look at this conclusion.
Of this infinite number of facts that are laying around you. Well, so what are you doing? Well, you're a mobile creature.
Thank you, Comcast. Let's try this again.
Orient yourself in the world and stories. And so then I started to assess the fundamental elements of stories. What might a story look like? And while I was doing that, that was informed by a number of other things that I was reading about, including...
Now watch his hands. What's he doing with his hands? Well, he's doing what we all do with his hands. He's putting it together, but he, like the rest of us, is an embodied creature. So we're putting it together. And
a set of... I read the neuroscience literature with regards to information processing fairly extensively. And that introduced me into a whole set of other ideas, including cybernetic ideas, which have been incorporated into what I was describing to you. And this basic cybernetic system is a system that has a starting point and a system that has an end point, and a system that has a subsystem that monitors progress or deviation from progress along the pathway to the end point. And I thought, well, that looks a lot like a story or a map. That's another way of thinking about it. And I thought, okay, well, that's where the overlap is. And the fundamental story is something like, it's very straightforward. It's also the frame that you inhabit when you conceptualize the world and narrow and simplify the world, which you have to do because it's so complex, because you have this infinite number of facts that are laying around you. Well, so what are you doing? Well, you're a mobile creature, a living creature, not a static information processor, and you're targeted. You're a targeted creature, and otherwise you wouldn't move.
So you've got an infinite number of facts. The world is, if not technically infinite, close enough to infinite in terms of overwhelm us. And so we can't process all these. So how do we do it? It's desire that orients us, and we're a targeting creature.
Right? To move is to be a targeted creature because you have to move towards something or away from something. So the targeting is built right into the fact that you're a mobile creature. And then you might say, well, what do you target? And the answer to that is, well, you could say you target what you aim for, but then you could say, well, you aim for what you want. You target your desires, and then that leads you into a discussion of the underlying neurobiology. Essentially, you bring to the table a set of inbuilt desires, and the targets that you pick have to address the fact that those desires exist, and the desires are actually grounded in necessity. And this is a sidebar, but this is where I think Piaget's theory is weaker than it should be, because Piaget, and you know I'm a great admirer of Piaget, believed that the human infant came into the world with a fairly primordial set of reflexes, mostly sensory motor reflexes, and then bootstrapped him or herself up on the basis of those reflexes in the sociological, in the social surround.
And remember, as again, according to Peterson, one of Piaget's big motivations, he's trying to fit together religion and science. He's trying to put this together. And you say, well, how does this fit into the question of religion and science?
It's a constructivist viewpoint. The child comes in with a few basic elements that can get it going, elements of exploration and memory, essentially. And then it builds itself as a consequence of its exploration in the social community. Now, I think that's true, except that it's too empty, because what it fails to take into consideration is the fact that, and I think this is an observation in some sense philosophically that was first made by Immanuel Kant when he criticized pure reason, is that you can't come into the world structureless. You have to come into the world with an inbuilt structure, and then it's the interaction of that structure with the world that provides the information that you can use to build yourself. But the structure has to be there, and I would say that's the same, mythologically speaking, as the idea that the Great Father is always there. Right? There's the Great Mother is always there, that's chaos itself. The Great Father is always there, that's order, that's the interpretive structure that you use to interact with the chaos, and then, of course, the individual is always there at this.
Now, what's important here is not necessarily how he pieces it together. I've had some conversation with Fulton Brown. What's her first name? I don't remember. But you know, she's got some interesting critiques of him in terms of mother father and the masculinity femininity stuff. But what's interesting here is that the assertion. This assertion undermines the subtraction story, because the subtraction story basically reduces us evolutionarily to, well, we're these frightened creatures, so we make up stories. And Peter says, so why are we making up stories? And are those stories simply random? And in fact, Peterson would say that we are built. See, now you're getting into my Calvinism, my John Calvin sensus divinitatis. That Alvin Plantinga will bring in all the time. That in fact, could it be that we are in fact built for this story making? That when we see into the sky, we are built to see things in a certain way. We are built to see things in the water and in the trees and in the ground. That we are built for this. And why would we be built for this? Well, now we're asking questions that science can't answer. Science might be able to say, well, we sure seemed that we were built for this. Now we're bumping up against the cosmological argument. Now we're scratching our head about the fine-tuning of the universe. Why is it we are built this way? And why is religion just a spandrel? Just this excess thing that develops? Or is this actually foundationally part of what it seems? If we can say we were made for something, it seems to be we were made for this. Well, once you say made for something, you are in fact implying, and via implication and under the cover asserting, that there is an author to this story and that this story is not simply random.
At the same time, Piaget, in some sense, retold that story, except he didn't give enough credence to the fact that the infant comes into the world far more fully formed than his theory presumes. Now, the problem with that is that without that additional underlying set of, let's call them neurobiological constraints, the interpretation universe gets too large. You need constraints to narrow the domain of phenomena that you're contending with. And it's in the analysis of the constraints that the answer to how do you stop drowning in an infinite number of potential interpretations emerges. the interpretations are subject to constraints. And that's also the way out of the moral relativist paradox, as far as I can tell. Now, one of the things I really liked about Piaget was that he described some of the constraints. One of the constraints was, well, if I'm going to exist in a social world, and I'm going to, because I won't exist at all if I don't exist in a social world, then there are constraints on the way that I have to interact with other people. And Piaget's essential point was, I have to organize myself to play a joint game with you, but the joint game has constraints, and one of them is you have to want to play because you have other options, and then there are other constraints. You and I have to be able to play in a way that other people don't object to, or maybe even that you and I have to play in a way that other people will support. And then you can imagine another constraint, which is you and I have to play a game in a way that other people would support that will last more than the moment. So it has to work today and tomorrow and next week. It has to work across a span of times. It has to work not only for you and I, but it has to work for our future selves. And so the damn constraints are starting to pile up. That's just on the sociocultural side. That's on the constructionist side only. But there's the biological constraints are equally important, because not only does the game that you and I have to play have to satisfy those emergent sociological constraints, but the game also has to be organized so that the internal polity that's composed of, let's call them the fundamental motivational and emotional systems that constitute us, they have to all find satisfaction, because otherwise the system grounds to a halt. And so this seems to me to be the beginnings of an answer to the postmodern conundrum. It's like, okay, any set of facts is amenable to an infinite number of interpretations. Fine, got it. That makes deriving an is from an ought a very difficult endeavor. Right, no problem. All right, but that doesn't mean that any old solution will work. Why? Well, first of all, it's merely because we introduced work into the conversation to begin with. The interpretation has to be functional, and again, that's what seems to tie it back to the story. This is also what got me interested in pragmatism, technically speaking. And so, because if your conundrum is here you are and there you have to be, and how to get there, then one of the constraints on the manner in which you interpret the world is, when you apply your interpretation, do you end up moving from the point you're at to the point you want to be? And if the answer to that is no, then the solution is insufficient. Now, you could call the solution untrue, but it's dangerous to...
This is where he kind of backtracks on what he said in Transcendental 2015.
To introduce the truth falsity dilemma, because it isn't, it's functionality more than truth. Although I think you could say that in the final analysis, truth is integrally linked to function. But
and part of what makes Peterson such a compelling preacher, and I use that word intentionally, is you can see when he's doing this lecture, this is his life. This is what he cares about.
I'm not going to touch that question for the time being. The point is that your interpretation of the world carries within it implicitly a theory about its own validity.
Your interpretation of the world carries within it a theory of its own validity. And I've been trying, okay, my Jungian cloud of witnesses has been watching Peterson, and they're all processing through his stuff. And this point where he deals with Piaget, I haven't been able to fully capture this and bring it into my conscious mind so I can articulate it and give you all a representation for it. But I think right here is in a sense where he makes what is kind of like the ontological argument for the existence of God. I think his view of the world, really devastates the subtraction story and exposes the subtraction story to being horribly naive and horribly unfair to our ancestors. And when you hear about C.S. Lewis's chronological snobbery and a great many other brilliant scholars who know the ancient world, when they look at the subtraction story and they look at what humanity has done over the years, they say these are brats thumbing their nose at better, wiser civilizations. This is the kind of dismissal that children do because they don't know any better. And Peterson makes the point here that, well, it's got to work, the Piaget point in terms of the game. It's got to work now, and it's got to work for me and for you, and it's got to work for future me, and it's got to work, and it had to work for past me. And this is all built into us. And when we see this, we begin to say, this can't just be random, and certainly it isn't random. And evolutionarily, you can look at this and say, okay, evolution has been paring down the pieces that don't work. And now we get a little bit into Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan's conversation about porcupines, and what Brett Weinstein talked about, romantic truth. But it's way more than that. And so this Piaget understanding of the games, now where does that go in terms of the rest of our world? Let me get back into the PowerPoint. See, and when I hear Peterson say this, I see C.S. Lewis's argument from Desire, and this argument is put quite succinctly in Alan Jacobs' book, The Narnian. You can find it in Mere Christianity. You can find it in any other philosophical books that start from C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis makes this point. Lewis would use this argument repeatedly. Lewis actually gets this argument from Tolkien. Okay, Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings. Lewis uses this argument repeatedly for the rest of his life, as he would write years later. Do what they will, we remain conscious of a desire which no natural happiness can satisfy. But is there any reason to suppose that reality offers any satisfaction to it? Nor does the being hungry prove that we have bread. But I think it may be urged that this misses the point. A man's physical hunger does not prove that man will get any bread. He may die of starvation on a raft in the Atlantic, but surely a man's hunger does prove that he comes from a race which repairs its body by eating and inhabits a world where eatable substances exist. Augustine said, to God in his Confessions. And again, if you're looking for one of the most brilliant men in all of human history, you've got to put Augustine in that list. Augustine, and he's got plenty of his own weirdnesses too, trust me on this, but Augustine, Augustine says to God, we are made for you. Well, here's the thing, that yeah, okay, we've got unlimited interpretations, but these limitations that come in seem to imply we are made for something. Now, we might say, well, we are made and shaped for survival, but the problem of Goliath, the alligator in the park in Florida, cries out to the materialist and says, we are not made for nothing, and you cannot actually satisfy a human being by giving him warm pools of water and chicken and lady alligators to fix him. We are made for something else. And Lewis says we are made for another world that this world can't satisfy. So that, in fact, if you put human beings, Dostoevsky sees this point, Huxley sees this point, Peterson sees this point. If you give a human being everything they need, or they think they need materially, physically, they will destroy the system themselves. Why? Because they know we are made for something else and we are striving for it, and we will kill ourselves to get there, which makes no sense if all we are Darwinian creatures. So this is where I come to my bigger frame, where, okay, yeah, the revenge of the materialist, but we die for things. And for Tolkien, well, how did Tolkien see this? Well, one of the, I think we see this partly. Here's my Jungian great cloud of internal cloud of witnesses. They're all the me's watching this, and we're watching each other, and we know somehow that okay, give me a winning lottery ticket. Take all constraints off of me in terms of my appetites and desires. And what will I do? Well, read a biography of Howard Hughes sometimes, and look at someone who has very little constraint on him and unlimited resources, and just ask yourself if this is the kind of human being you aspire to be, or the kind of life you like to have. Your cloud of witnesses knows this. And in fact, one of the things that I want to get into when I start talking about cultures and knowing is that the reason Peterson will put God in scare quotes is because if you look at this Jungian cloud of witnesses, and if you look at our unconscious and even maybe a collective unconscious, you could say, well, God inhabits somewhere in this system, and things pop up in my mind, and I think, oh, this is the Holy Spirit, or this is God, or this is the spirits, or this is revelation, and you can derive a phenomenologically reasonable argument for that, but if God made us for him, well, if God made us to hear him and to see him, he would give us eyes to see and ears to hear. And when Jesus says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear, Jesus isn't talking about these things. What's he talking about? Well, God has given us, and again, this is where Alvin Plantinga goes in his Sensus Divinitatis. God has made us to know him. Well, how? Well, he's given us the stuff, and he's made us to know truth. Well, how? Well, that's kind of where we're going to go with C.S. Lewis and his book Miracles. Well, how do we know the truth? Well, how can we know the truth? Because the real challenge here, which Lewis, Alvin Plantinga makes essentially the same argument as Lewis, but Alvin Plantinga makes it as a technical philosopher within philosophy, and most of us aren't philosophers, so we're better off reading Lewis, because Lewis will make the argument so much better for a layman to figure out, because Lewis is just such a great writer. And we are made for this. It is built into us to see God. Now this, because we are not perfect at this, we are children at this, but we are made to see God. That is why religion develops, because this is what we're built for. And you could argue that, in Peterson's terms, we're acting it out. And in a sense, Lewis would say that in some ways, all of these past mythologies and religions do they go off the road? Yeah. But, I got to deal with my with antithetical Calvinists too in this, but Lewis would say these are good dreams. Boy, that sounds pretty Jungian, doesn't it? These are good dreams. These are good stories. These are us acting at it, but it's our fallen selves acting at it, and this is where I think Freud could be brought back into the situation reasonably. I should tag Bulverism. I just rewatched that video this morning of the C.S. Lewis doodle on Bulverism. Why do we go off the rail? Well, we go off the rail for all kinds of reasons. Why do churches screw up? Why do churches abuse people? Why do religious people use religion as an excuse to do the horrible things that human beings always do for each other? Well, because religion is a handy excuse. But that doesn't destroy the validity of religion. Just like we use our hands to do harm to each other, that doesn't destroy the validity of hands. It just speaks to what it is inside of us that is acting. And this is exactly where we're getting at the question of, I don't personally like the term free will. I like real agency, because our wills are not free. Our wills are constrained by all kinds of things, but we are real agents. And this gets into the question of agency. Is our agency fully compromised by our psychology, by our biology? Now I come from a tradition that says we have a human nature. I am not a social constructivist that says our human nature is simply a social construction. No, it's built into our biology, but I would say that not only is our behavior built into our biology, but our longing to look for God is also built into our biology. And why is Jordan Peterson helpful? Because Jordan Peterson, for me, is helping me connect some dots, or at least suggesting that these dots can be connected, that in fact what Augustine said is that we are made for him. And if we figure that out, maybe we can figure out where on earth this idea, how the story in the Old Testament that has, the Old Testament is a very secular book, and that, everything is kind of within the box. But then in the intertestamental period and in Daniel, we get into this idea of resurrection, that the box will be broken. And this comes then when you have the resurrection of Jesus. What happens in there is that, read N.T. Wright in this and his Resurrection of the Son of God, another big fat book for you to read. N.T. Wright will say, for the Jews, the resurrection of Jesus means that the ultimate resurrection is beginning. We're in the last days. We're in the end times. And God has begun his work of redeeming and reclaiming and restoring us here yet in history. And we're pointing to the end of the story, where there will be no more sea and where the gates of the New Jerusalem will be left open all the time. We're in that process, and we're only seeing hints of it now. And our Jungian cloud of witnesses, all the little sub-Paul Vanderklays that are back there watching Jordan Peterson, that are, trying to think real hard to take in this guy. And when I say, well, let's move on to something else, another one says, no, stick with that Jordan Peterson. There's something interesting there. He's getting at something that you need to see. So don't let him go quite yet. Keep making your little videos. Keep talking to the other Jordan Peterson fans out there, and keep working these problems, because we're piecing the thing together, me and this committee, inside my head. Now I wanted to get into The Hobbit, because Tolkien. I'll pull up the audiobook and let the narrator read it, because he does it so well.
The courage of quite small people. Not all Tolkien's war experiences, however, produced such dark narratives. In a letter to W.H. Auden, he explained how the idea for The Hobbit, the prequel to The Lord of the Rings, first came into his mind. It happened years after the war, after he had become professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University, while he was sitting and grading student papers. On a blank leaf I scrawled, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. I did not and do not know why. Names always generate a story in my mind. Eventually, I thought I'd better find out what hobbits were like."
Now here it's fascinating, because what's in Tolkien's cloud of witnesses? Well, he's got World War I back there, and again, this was a book recommendation by someone dropped it in the comments, said, "Oh, you're talking about Lewis and Tolkien. You should read this book." And I've been reading this book, and this book has been sensational. And but where do the hobbits come from? Well, Tolkien survived this war, and Tolkien watched this war, and well, what would you say? That hobbits aren't real? Yeah, hobbits aren't real. Not in the sense that Tolkien's are, but hobbits are real. Well, it depends what you mean as real. I'll get back to the storyteller and the book.
We don't know why Tolkien wrote those enigmatic words, but we do know what hobbits are like. From his own account, the character of the hobbit was a reflection of the ordinary soldier, steadfast in his duties, while suffering in that dreary hole in the ground, the front-line trench. Most of the members of the British Expeditionary Force were citizen soldiers, drawn largely from the working classes. Unlike the French, Italian, Russian, and German armies, the BEF did not experience a large-scale collapse in discipline or morale. Even during the most intensive campaigns along the Western Front, they showed a remarkable resilience relative to other armies. The change in character that comes over Sam Gamgee was probably not unlike the transformation that Tolkien must have witnessed among many of his fellow soldiers in battle. But even as hope died in Sam, or seemed to die, it was turned to a new strength. Sam's plain hobbit face grew stern, almost grim, as the will hardened in him, and he felt through all his limbs a thrill, as if he was turning into some creature of stone and steel that neither despair nor weariness nor endless barren miles could subdue. If this was the character of the British soldier in the Great War, then it explains the admiration of Tolkien and many others over the years. As John Keegan concludes in The Face of Battle, the British Expeditionary Force of 1916 was one of the most remarkable and admirable military formations ever to have taken the field. In his magisterial work, The World Crisis, Winston Churchill extolled the qualities of the British Army with his usual eloquence. Unconquerable except by death, they set up a monument of native virtue which will command the wonder, the reverence, and the gratitude of our island people as long as we endure as a nation among men. Even Sir Philip Gibbs, who became severely critical of military leadership, confessed his astonishment at the valor of British troops, praising the individual courage beyond the normal laws of human nature, as I thought I knew them once. Historians still debate the ultimate achievement of these soldiers and the causes for which they fought. Were they merely fodder for a vast and merciless military machine that ravaged Europe to no good end? Or did they play a vital role in halting German aggression and preventing the dominance of a brutal and oppressive juggernaut over the continent?
Now, if you watch my video on the divine lobster, this for me personally is where it all comes down. Why am I a Christian? Why do I believe this stuff? Because I have, I grew up in Patterson, and I worked in the Dominican Republic, and I saw Haitians, and I work with people now who struggle and die. And if you look at human history, you say, how much? Excuse me. Is all of this for nothing? And I look at Peterson talking about Piaget, and I say, okay, well, all of this has to work. All of this has to work not only for us, but for future us. And not only for me, but for future me. And it has to work, yesterday and tomorrow. And you look at all of human history. And so I look at Peterson launching this out, and I say, okay, I understand your Darwinian frame and why you say, well, I can't take it beyond here. Well, I think actually the resurrection of Jesus Christ launches us beyond there. And I think the revelation of Jesus Christ in his resurrection says that little people are not in vain. Read the book of 2 Corinthians, and where Paul talks about who we are. We are crushed but not perplexed. Now, this is a book in which I don't think I videotaped my Sunday school lessons on 2 Corinthians, but this is a book where the Corinthians they thought they were big people and important people, and Paul Paul is this little apostle. He's not even Peter. He didn't get to see Jesus. And Paul says, we are crushed. We are destroyed. We are dismissed by the world. But in Christ, we have our hope and our future. And this is, in fact, the entire story of the Word becoming flesh. And now, one of the elements that Peterson talks about John 1 and the Word becoming flesh. Peterson doesn't go much into the other narrative where you have Jesus, who's the son of a king. This is 1 Peter, becoming nothing for our sake. Also the book of Philippians. And Tolkien, a good Roman Catholic that he is, sees this. And it gets into his head. And how does he express it? He expresses it in a Hobbit.
Whatever Tolkien thought about these questions, he was careful never to demean the significance of the soldier at his post. I have always been impressed that we are here surviving because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds. The hobbits were made small, he explained, to show up in creatures of very small physical power the amazing and unexpected heroism of ordinary men at a pinch. Tolkien, the soldier, lived among these ordinary men, fought alongside them, witnessed their courage under fire, joked with them, mourned with them, and watched them die. Thus, the small people who fought and suffered in the Great War helped inspire the creation of the unlikely heroes in Tolkien's greatest imaginative work. Like the soldiers in that war, the homely hobbits could not have perceived how the fate of nations depended on their stubborn devotion to duty. Perhaps this was Tolkien's quiet way of suggesting that we may, in the end, owe more to these forgotten dead than our modern temperament allows. That is a chapter of ancient history which it might be good to recall, advises Gandalf in the Fellowship of the Ring. For there was sorrow then too, and gathering dark, but great valor and great deeds that are not wholly vain.
And I can't help but when I hear that, again, I hear we labor not in vain. And yeah. When I look at the frames of this world, Peterson has to contend with the materialist frame, and in a sense that's where William Lane Craig tags him. But if the postmoderns are right, you can't give me a should that says I can't believe this stuff. And in fact, if I'm going to believe this stuff, I want to live in this stuff. If you're in the Star Wars fandom, which again the Ein boss, I wish I had Roland here to help me with the pronunciation. In that video, Peterson says, well, Star Wars is mythology for engineers. Yeah. Well, if you're into Star Wars, you might as well be into it. But poor you who are into Star Wars, because you've got somewhere between George Lucas and Disney as stewards over your fandom, over your universe. Well, I prefer my fandom and my universe, and every week I get to go live in it with my brothers and sisters in Christ, and in fact every day I get to go live in it in terms of my devotion. And if the materialists are right, well then the good news, and I always smile when I watch shows about this. Well, the universe will grow cold and will break down and it'll all mean nothing. The good news is that you get to die before then. Yeah, that's real good news. I've got better news for you. And that better news is in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, when his disciples touch his hands and his feet, and it begins to dawn on them. And again, Jonathan Peugeot and I talked a little bit about the resurrection in the conversation that we did together. That all of the N.T. Wright makes the observation that all of the witnesses of the resurrection that we have in the Bible, the witnessing of the resurrection, gives all the earmarks of people looking at something they couldn't understand, which is exactly what you would expect. So my father passed away 5 years ago. Let's say I open the door of my house and my father is standing before me. I wouldn't know my father. But somehow I could imagine that if a man was standing before me that looked just like my father and sounded like my father and had information that looked, information that, say, very few people, like within my nuclear family, would know. And then I'd look on my father's chest, and there were the burn marks from where the paramedics tried to resuscitate him after his heart attack in a diner, and say, look at the burn marks, it is I would still look at my father and just kind of blink, because, well, everything that Jordan Peterson teaches us about psychology would, this we would try to get around this. And lately there's been all of these different television shows that try to get at this idea of coming back from the dead and how to process that. And it is, as Jung says, this is all kind of like dreams to us. But I live in my fandom, and I live in it to believe, what Tolkien here, the point he makes, that we labor not in vain, even if you labor anonymously, even if you labor and nobody knows it or cares or sees, even if you labor and people despise you for it. Well, read the Gospels. Jesus talks about that. And this, again, is why in my sermons I always talk about misery, deliverance, gratitude. We labor out of gratitude. Our labor does not bring about our salvation. Our labor is an expression of gratitude as a result of the gifts that we've been given. So this is why I think Peterson undermines the subtraction story and leaves the door open for God. And I see a lot of people seeing an open door. And I'll tell you what human beings are like. When human beings see an open door, they usually walk in because we're nosy. And I'd say we walk into that door and we look for God because we have been made for him. Now, if we want to continue to believe this and if we want to sustain belief in it, well, then we're going to have to do things that sustain belief in it, because there's a lot around us that says, no, you can't believe in that. So there's my video for today.